All right, it's time to start a new module, lesson 6, and the title of this lesson is called The Demand Curve. Now, a lot of you folks, I'm sure, have heard of supply and demand somewhere along the way. And this is sort of, I guess you would say, the basics of what economics is really all about, especially in a free market system. The demand and supply curves. And what we're going to do over the next couple lessons is we're going to look at each piece of the market, the demand curve, today. And then in our next lesson, we'll look at the supply curve. And then we'll wrap up this unit by trying to put everything all together. So let's go ahead and start by taking a look at the demand curve. Before we do that, I want to warm you up just a little bit here. So the first thing, as I mentioned a minute ago, supply and demand are the forces that make markets work. Now, when you think of a market, what do you imagine? You probably imagine some place where everybody's going shopping, right? Well, how does that place work? It only works if there's two people involved, somebody who wants to buy something and somebody who wants to sell something. Where those two things come together, that's called a market. So a market is a group of buyers and sellers of a particular good or service. In that situation, buyers determined demand, or we sometimes call them the demanders. The people who want things and are looking to purchase things are the demanders. People who are selling things or supplying things, we call the suppliers. They determine the supply curve. It's really important to note that demand and supply are independent forces. They each have their own motives. They each have their own reasons for doing what they do. And I think that'll make more sense as time goes along. What we're going to do today is focus only on this part of the story. Our next lesson will move to the supply curve. But for now, we're going to start by just looking at demand. Okay, so what actually is demand? All right, well, the first thing is I want to make sure it's clear when we use the word demand that there's a couple different ways we express it. The first thing we're going to talk about is what's called quantity demanded. And what that is the amount of a good that buyers are willing and able to purchase. So how many do they want to buy? That's the quantity they demand. Okay, now what does the law of demand states? The law of demand states that if other things are equal, meaning basically if everything else is, we're not worrying about anything else, the quantity demanded of a good falls when the price of a good rises. Let me say that again. The quantity of a good falls when the price of a good rises, the quantity demanded of that good. And I think that just makes sense, right? If something's more expensive, less people are willing to buy it. That's not a theory. That's not sometimes it's true. It's called the law of demand. And as we maybe know from science class, laws are always true. When prices rise, people will have less quantity demand for that good. They will want to buy less of that good. Now, we can actually show you this in what's called a demand schedule. And a demand schedule really is just a table that shows the relationship between those two important things, the price of a good and the quantity demanded, or the quantity that we demand. Let's take a look at what a demand schedule actually looks like. All right, let's take our friend Catherine here and her ice cream. Now, you're going to notice two important pieces of information. Anytime you go and you want to get something, you really have to consider two things. How many are going to be purchased and at what price. And you see both of those things here. So for example, at $0, apparently Catherine would like 12 ice cream cones. So if they were free, she would want 12 of them. If they cost her, let's say $1, she only wants 8 of them. At $2, she wants 4 of them. And at $3, that's too much money for her. She's not going to buy any, 0. Now, does this chart follow the law of demand? As it turns out, it looks like it does. The price of ice cream increases, and as it increases, the quantity that she wants to buy decreases. So this is a perfect example of the law of demand. Now, as economists, tables and theories are great, but what's our favorite way of explaining things? Well, generally, it's with a graph. So let's take a look at what Catherine's demand might look like on a graph. Now, we've reposted that little demand table, demand schedule up there in the right-hand corner. So let's take a look. We're going to plot each point. Well, the very bottom point on her demand curve says that at $3, she wants 0 ice cream cones. So there we go. Now quickly, you'll just notice the price is on the y-axis. The quantity that she's demanding is on the x-axis. Does it actually have to be that way? I guess technically it doesn't, but the general form in economics is to put price on the y-axis and quantity on the x-axis. If you don't do that, you're probably going to drive someone crazy. So price will always go on the y-axis, quantity will always go on the x-axis. All right, her next point was at the price of $2.50, she would have a quantity demand of 2. So we'll fill that one in. At the price of $2, she'd have a quantity demand of 4. $1.50 was 6, $1 was 8, 50 cents was 10, and as we mentioned at the end, $0 no price would be 12. Now what we're going to do is we're going to connect all of those dots together. And when we do that, we get what's known as her demand curve. Now, her demand curve, as you can see, has a downward slope. And again, we learned in our graphing lesson that what that means is price and quantity have what's known as a negative relationship, meaning that if one goes one way, the other goes the other. So as price is decreasing, quantity is increasing, and vice versa. As price increases, quantity is decreasing. Based on the law of demand, that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Okay, so let's just kind of make sure we're clear. If we take, for example, here, the price, and we drop it from 2 to $1.50, we're going to notice that we move from quantity 4 to quantity 6. And again, that fits perfectly with what we know of the law of demand. All right, great. Let's move along. Okay, now, we want to make sure that we understand the difference between a change in demand for a good and a change in quantity demand. And we're going to start by talking about a change in quantity demand. Now remember what quantity demand is. It's the amount of a good that someone's willing to buy at a certain price. So let's take a look. Okay, generally, if we're talking about a change in quantity demand, we're talking about a movement along the demand curve. In other words, moving from one place on the demand curve to another place on the demand curve. And what's the only thing that can cause that to happen? The answer is a change in price of this product, whatever it is we're talking about. So if her ice cream cones went up in price, then we would move from one place on the demand curve to another place on the demand curve. And I think it'll make clear why we're trying to make a distinction once we see some other options that could happen. But let's take a look at what a change in quantity demand actually looks like. Okay, so again, let's say we're back here and we have some good that costs $1, and apparently at $1, there's a quantity demand of 8. Now, if the price was to rise, and again, making a note there, an event that raises the price of ice cream cone results in a movement along the demand curve. Okay, so let's say the price rises to $2. Now, we don't know why the price might rise to $2. There's probably many, many reasons. The government could put a tax on it. There could be a change in a lot of things. But for right now, let's just assume that the price is rising to $2. Well, by the law of demand, if the price rises, then the quantity demanded will decrease. In this case, it's going to decrease, let's say, to 4. Now, what you're going to notice here is that, again, we've only moved from one point on the demand curve to another point on the demand curve. And what caused that to happen? A change in price. What we're going to look at now is what happens when the demand curve itself moves and what the difference is. Just quickly, here's what I want to explain about changing quantity demand. One of the ways I think about it is this. The entire demand curve sort of represents how someone feels about a good, how much they like it. So let's take a look at ice cream. How much do you like ice cream? Well, by moving from point A to point B, we don't like ice cream any less or more. Our feelings about ice cream, what we get from ice cream, hasn't changed at all. The only thing that's changed is that because ice cream is more expensive, we probably aren't going to be able to buy as much of it. But our feeling about ice cream, how much goodness, I like to say, we get from it, that hasn't changed at all. That's what a change in quantity demand is. It only happens when there's a change in price. The difference is what's called a shift of the demand curve. Now that's a little bit different. Let's take a look at what that might mean. So what is the difference between a change in quantity demand as opposed to a change in demand? A shift of the demand curve either to the left or to the right. Now let me bounce back for 1 second. What we were noticing in this graph was that we were simply moving up and down the demand curve. The demand curve itself wasn't moving. That's a change in quantity demand. A change in demand is when the demand curve itself actually gets up and moves, either to the left or to the right. And what that is, it's caused by any change that alters the quantity demand for every single price. Every price, the quantity demand is going to be different. And I think a better way to explain this is with a picture. Okay, just a couple things I want to point out first. Now, the graph that we drew a few minutes ago had lots of little detailed points, right? For every price, we had a quantity and we labeled every single one of those points. And really, that's just fine. But what we're going to be drawing here right now is going to be a much more common way that we'll be using graphs. Generally speaking, especially in our beginner level of economics here, we're not usually so concerned about every specific individual point. We really want to see general ideas. So what are our graphs usually going to look like? And this is an important thing to note. The first thing is here, obviously, you're going to have an X and Y axis. You'll notice how we're going to label the X and Y axis. Since the y-axis is always going to be the price, there's no reason to write that out every time. We will always label it with a large capital P. That's the generally accepted abbreviation for price. And on the x-axis, we'll always label that with a capital Q. And again, that's the generally accepted abbreviation for quantity. Let's draw our first demand curve. Let's assume that we have a demand curve. Now again, we know it's going to be downward sloping. Always is, because of the law of demand. We also know that we're going to label our demand curves with a D. Again, because we so often use that, the D all by itself is perfectly fine. And because this is our first demand curve, we're going to label it with what we call sub 1, or D sub 1. A D with a little 1 next to it. That's how our demand curves are going to look. Now, a couple things we're going to notice about this. The first is this. What's the difference, again, between a change in demand and a change in quantity demand? Well, a change in quantity demand would be if we were sliding up and down on this demand curve. And again, what would we say would cause that? A change in price. But suppose this happened. The demand curve shifted, what we say, to the right, or the demand curve increases. Now, that's very different than a change in quantity demand. This is a change in demand. What's the difference? Well, here's the difference. What we're really saying now is at every single price, there is a different quantity demanded. Every single one. We're going to label our new demand curve with D2. And again, this is going to be an increase in demand or a shift to the right. Those are both phrases that get used. The opposite would be a decrease in demand or a shift to the left. In this case, we'll label it D3. And again, here's the difference really between a change in demand and a change in quantity demand. Again, a change in quantity demand is moving along one of the curves. For example, just take the center one. If I went up and down this curve in different places, that would be a change in quantity demand. But a change in demand is when the whole curve moves. And here's a way to think about it. Let's just pick a random price. We'll say P1. Now here's another point to note. When you're labeling an individual point on an axis, you're going to label it with a smaller p and a sub number. The first one would be sub 1. So I'm labeling right now one individual point on the y-axis. This p refers to the entire y-axis. This p refers to this one specific price. Now, At that price, the original curve, there was a certain quantity. We'll call that Q1. And again, this Q refers to one specific point on the x-axis. Now, what's happened is with a change in demand, as opposed to a change in quantity demand, what we'll notice is when that shift occurred, what happened was at the exact same price, we had a new change in quantity. So for some reason, without a change in price, we wanted more of that good. And again, the way I described it before, we now have a different feeling about that good. Let's say it's ice cream. It really means that for whatever reason, we like ice cream more than we used to. Remember, a change in quantity demand was only about the price of the good. But now we're saying, even at the same price, I want more. Why do I want more? Because for some reason, I have a lot more joy out of that good. I get a lot more benefit from that good. And so my demand has shifted. Of course, it's also possible to have the opposite happen, which is that you get less joy out of ice cream. Maybe, I don't know, maybe you're on a diet and you're trying to eat a little bit less ice cream. In that case, that would be demand shift to the left. Okay, that's a little introduction to the demand curve and how it works. It's important to know if this was microeconomics, we'd be spending a lot more time on this topic. And in fact, one of the questions you might be asking is, well, what causes a demand curve to shift? Well, we know what causes a change in quantity demand. We said that was just a change in price, moving up and down the demand curve. But what actually changes the demand curve itself, causes it to shift to the right, increase, or shift to the left, decrease? Well, the answer is a couple of things, and I'll just list them here quickly. Consumer income, if people have more money, the demand curve is going to increase. The price of related goods, like for example, if I was talking about bagels and donuts. Bagels and donuts probably replace each other, so if bagels increased in price, I might have more demand for donuts. Tastes, just trend if something becomes more popular. If people think about the future, that something's going to happen to that good, like for example, if you're buying tires for your car and you're afraid that in the future the tire place is going to run out, you might have a little more demand for that good right now. And the number of buyers, the population, right? If there's more people, obviously there's going to be more people buying the good. The reason I went through this last slide so quickly is because this is what we would focus on in microeconomics. We're not going to ask you to know the individual details of why the demand curve moves in the macroeconomics course. What is important for macroeconomics is just to understand how the demand curve moves to the right and to the left, and to understand the difference between quantity demand and a change in quantity demand and a change in demand.